There's a need for the developed world and for our partners in the West to perhaps make greater effort to understand how we shape our worldviews. It's critical that we see that interests matter, and fewer countries now will give in to shaming on values, and that will also trigger a trend towards multipolarity.
I think that this idea of self-reliance is something that all major powers which ended up becoming superpowers have gone through at some point through their economic development.
Europe is now trying to realize that it has perhaps not been very active when it comes to geopolitics. We would also like to point out the division between the Anglosphere and continental Europe when it comes to the big questions of Indo-Pacific and various geopolitical changes which are taking place.
Indians tend to have a sense of history which is slightly different from how the West looks at history. When there is a statement that comes out which is not particularly friendly, it seems kind of jarring or is not related to what the reality is in India, people turn around and say, that, why does the West behave in this particular fashion? And because India is a democracy, eventually, if this keeps building over time, you do not want anti-Western sentiment to build up in a relationship which should be very strong and should help each other out.
Hello and welcome to Velina's talk. Today I have two guests with me, and the topic of our conversation is geoeconomics and connectivity projects from India's perspective. My first guest is Jyotsna Mehra. She's New Delhi-based foreign policy observer, and she graduated with a Master in Science in Modern South Asian Studies from the University of Oxford in 2018. She was a 2021 South Asian Voices Visiting Fellow at the Simpson Center in Washington, D.C. She also works at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi as a consultant, but today she is expressing her own views and positions on foreign and security matters. My second guest today is Surya Kanegaonkar. He is a commodities trader and also columnist on geopolitical and geoeconomic issues based in Switzerland. He writes for The Hindu, for CNN, News 18, and Fair Observer, where he covers subjects related on raw materials, natural resources, and, as I said, also geopolitics and geoeconomics. This episode of Velina's Talks is actually the first episode after the summer break. Is possible thanks to the cooperation with Bharatvaarta, India's leading podcast producer on politics, policy, and society. And I would like to start with this conversation with the topic of the Indo-Pacific, namely on the one side to hear Jyotsna's opinion on the future of, actually on the state of affairs and the future of the quadrilateral format, following this tragic event, but then again to catch up with Surya's opinion on the newly launched and let's say alternative concepts, which are very much, of course, related to the Indo-Pacific, but also include new regional powers. And in this particular case, we are talking about the I2U2 concepts, which he will actually introduce and elaborate on. So let's start, Jyotsna, with your actually elaboration on the Quad.
Thank you, Velina, and thank you, Bharatvaarta, for having us. As you rightly pointed out, Prime Minister Abe was one of the pioneers of the concept of Indo-Pacific. He has been talking about it since the early 2000s, in terms of the confluence of the two great oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And he started talking about the need to develop the security diamond, which is the quadrilateral in this region to counter threats emerging out of a rising and increasingly aggressive China. But the Quad over the years has become quite central to our Indo-Pacific vision, even though in several official statements we have been quite wary, and not just India, but also Japan, of linking the Quad with the Indo-Pacific. But that hesitance has dropped in the last few years, especially since 2017. The quadrilateral relationship has taken off. And in the last 2 years or so, during the pandemic, we have seen a form of a formalization of the Quad, in the sense that there are working groups which are working on vaccines, on climate change, on tech. But that is not to say that the Quad is a structured multilateral organization like the ASEAN, because one of the strengths of the Quad is that it is a flexible organization. It is about getting on a call with these 4 countries whenever something happens and finding a solution. It's about developing those habits of cooperation and letting the agenda evolve organically. While the focus has been on vaccines, on tech, on climate change, that is not to say that the focus has been diverted away from, say, issues concerning China in the region or defense and security issues. They, of course, don't get featured as much in joint statements. What gets featured are concerns about security and stability of the Indo-Pacific, which, of course, points towards concerns which are related to China. Also, I would like to point out that, there's been a lot of debate about the Quad. Some have called it the Asian NATO, and some have just dismissed it as seafoam, so as to say that it is a toothless organization, which is a talking shop. But like I pointed out, the strength really lies in the fact that it is a flexible organization. I'll just elaborate quickly on some of the areas that the Quad is working on. Yes, so even if we look at cooperation beyond COVID, I think one of the areas which I have argued that the Quad could work on would be on diversifying active pharmaceutical ingredient supply chains in one area. Here there are opportunities to work with countries like Israel, Singapore, UK, France, and Germany. Also on tech, the Quad is already working on a statement of principles for the foundation of a sort of a common narrative that these countries, which could arguably take to tech standard setting organizations like the International Telecommunications Union, ISO, etc. And the Quad is also working on a lot of science and tech-based projects. One of the areas that we could potentially consider is finalizing artificial intelligence-related defense and intelligence cooperation agreements, either bilaterally or in a quadrilateral setup. These could also be sort of accommodated within the existing agreements that we have with these 4 countries. Maritime domain awareness is another area that we've been working on. I think the overall point that I want to draw home is that what India has articulated quite often of late, it is that we see that the foremost attention should be given to national interests. The agenda of multilateral organizations should be action-oriented, and reformed multilateralism would mean that the focus should be more on outcome and less on structures. Ultimately, for India, this is about furthering diplomacy to reduce critical dependencies on adversarial states and bolstering Indian private sector, which fits within the larger vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I think that there are similarities here with the I2U2, which Surya could elaborate on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So let's move to the new Quad, which aims to deepen economic cooperation between the United States, India, but also Israel and United Arab Emirates. So Surya, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Velina. I think that the I2U2, it's a very new arrangement. It's a new conceptualization, relatively new compared to the Quad. It's got off the blocks quite quickly, at least to the point that there's been a meeting between the leaders and a commitment to an investment of $2 billion in Indian agricultural industries at the moment. So I think basically what this arrangement is doing is it's connecting 4 countries which have strong bilateral relationships between themselves in a larger economic connectivity project where each country will be able to add some value along this supply chain. Together, we'll be able to create efficiencies for all countries involved. Essentially, India has a low-cost labor market and a growing manufacturing sector. You see the UAE as a trade hub, a global trade hub. We look at Israel in terms of its connectivity, its strategic location, its opening up to to the Mediterranean and beyond. And obviously the US as one of the largest consumers of goods and services globally. Essentially what this does is that connectivity and trade integration really unlocks these efficiencies, which is many times been just dominated by China and within China. We see that many countries have just outsourced a lot of what their requirements are to a single state, which has come with very significant risks, as we have seen in the recent past. The disruptions in supply chains have really brought to the fore the need to create resilience through new arrangements and new multilateral relationships. So this I2U2 arrangement it's obviously very new. It's got a lot of things that will start building up. It's not just confined to agriculture and the medical space, but it's also going into emerging technologies and sharing of best practices and creating sound trade linkages between the countries. And we have to also remember that India's FTA with the UAE, its emerging FTA with Europe potentially, perhaps something with the UK, will also fit into this as a part of a much, much larger raising of India's value in providing stability for the West and parts of the Middle East as well. So, and I think this is essentially going to have an impact on the Indo-Pacific as well, because many of these players are involved in even if it's the Western Indo-Pacific or the United States across in the Pacific itself. So I think that India working both ways with the Quad and with these three countries here will really create a robust architecture in the future.
My takeaway is that it is indeed about global supply chains reconfiguration. It is about the growing importance of the new position of India as a, let's say, regional, but also global hub, being in many relevant areas. If you take a look at the initiatives being discussed within Quad, but also within the new Quad, you basically find a lot of points of intersection, from energy and food to trade, logistics and supply chain, but also, of course, health issues. Now, would you actually consider this project rather as one that will not really be institutionalized in the future, because as was mentioned, it's more about outcome-oriented initiative rather than, institutionalization. And also there is, in fact, no time for institutionalization given the speed and the scale of changes right now in global affairs. And the second is, would that be also something that could create a cleavage between the Anglosphere countries in the West and those from continental Europe? Because the way if we look at the map, of course, Anglosphere countries like, let's say, UK at the center of it as the most relevant US strategic partner, has also entered the Security and Defense Pact with Australia, and also, in fact, are considering deepening relations, security-related relations with Japan. Would India be incentivized to participate in that, and what would that mean also for West Asia? Maybe a short take on your side.
Sure. I think that it's very hard to formalize something like the I2U2 beyond some sort of outcomes that the four countries will work towards. But I think that once the infrastructure linkages are built, for example, Adani is building the port developing the port at Haifa. The Chinese have built a port not very far away. We have to remember that the Etihad rail, I think that will be done by 2030. So we're seeing that once these linkages are built, the free market forces kind of come into play by themselves. They use the capacity that's there, and they leverage the free trade agreements, the strong bilateral relationships that exist, and once you start seeing the capacity utilization rise of this trade corridor, it starts having its own geopolitical implications in and of itself on other blocks and other parts of the world. Now, I think that the Middle East is also it's kind of not necessarily in one camp or the other. We see that obviously the UAE has very close ties with China. Israel, to some extent, it has ties with China, but Obviously, with American influence, it's not moving as close as some of their Middle Eastern neighbors. And India is quite clearly not in the Chinese camp. So I think that you have to see how much of once you create a robust network and strong trade flows, then eventually that itself will create its own leverage for each of these countries along the way. And in the context of India, I would say that a lot of and this is a slight departure from the question that you had asked, but I think that internal reforms in India, the domestic spend on infrastructure and connectivity, is as important as the outbound connectivity that we see, because this is essentially what will decide how much India can really contribute to stability and resilience in global supply chains and how much it can be scaled. If we go back, for example, to Chinese manufacturing in, say, 2004, their manufacturing output was around $640 billion. They doubled that in a span of 4 years, and they doubled that again in a span of 5 years. So we're seeing that there was a Bain report that came out on Indian manufacturing, which is right now around $440 billion. They have a target of $1 trillion by 2028. It's quite good if they're able to get there, but I genuinely think that there have to be more reforms in India to be able to really make the country into a much larger and more important manufacturing hub for the world, so that both the Quad and the I2U2 are able to extract more benefits from this and optimize. The second point, I think that Jyotsna might be better able to answer that, if that's okay.
Yes, Jyotsna, feel free to jump into the conversation.
Yes. So no, I just wanted to add to that, that the focus of the ITU2 seems to be more on geoeconomics than geopolitics. And it is vital that it remains so, at least in the short term, because there clearly, like Surya pointed out, there are divergences on critical questions vis-a-vis Russia and China, but there are also important convergences. But if this group has to move forward, it is important that there's no pressure for the countries to choose between one camp or another.
Mm-hmm. And I will just to wrap it up, argue that currently we no longer can differentiate between geoeconomics and geopolitics, that the one goes very often along with the other, which is why we often will see geopolitical interests, when a certain geoeconomic format is launched, as you've actually already outlined. Now let's move to the International North-South Transport Corridor, which is another example, in fact, for a project that has, I think, lasted over 20 years, has been in discussion, negotiations, and in fact was in the planning for more than 20 years. Basically, a more than 7,000 kilometers long multi-mode network connectivity of ship, rail, and road routes, which is supposed to move goods from India via, once again, South Asia and West Asia, Central Asia, and then connecting Russia. Basically, the idea is to also, of course, reach out to Europe. Now, with the war that Russia launched against Ukraine on February 24th, in reality, Russia was in a dire need for alternative logistics and supply chains because of the severe Western sanctions. And interestingly, one part of this North-South transport corridor became operative out of strategic need. Let's put it that way. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the project. How do you think that it's indeed feasible? It entails a lot of elements. How do you place this connectivity around the North-South transport corridor, and specifically the role, of course, now of Iran following a possible Iran deal 2.0 in the geopolitical and the geoeconomic context that we've discussed. So Surya, you start now first, and then we move also to our colleague Jyotsna for her comments.
I think the INSTC clearly, as you had mentioned, it was something in the works for a very long period of time, and it's come into operation when it was actually of dire need for one of the countries. So I think that it was not just a very natural trade route. It's a natural trade route historically. just like how I-2, U-2 across India through to the Mediterranean was a very, like we talk about going back thousands of years, these are very traditional trade routes in some way. But in this case, if we look at the INSTC, I think it just has not got that life of its own as yet because of the lack of strong economic linkages between India and Russia and the sort of purchasing power and requirements that are there from Russia, which you actually will end up seeing more in Europe. So I think that the European branch of the INSTC eventually will probably end up becoming the more important element of this route. But while the Russian side of it will be more leveraged for geopolitical purposes, perhaps with less capacity utilization and actual volume of goods, but criticality of those goods will have a geopolitical element and value to it itself. And I think that when we look at the context of kind of a reordering of the world and a Europe, which I personally, from the ringside view that I have of the energy markets and the financial markets, I see that there is a very high probability of large-scale deindustrialization in Europe. Eventually, you will end up seeing Europe becoming more of a consumption economy where it ends up purchasing a lot of the goods that it initially used to manufacture within its own borders from countries abroad. This trade route from India through into Europe, which will be more efficient than and less cost and have less of a transportation cost than the one from China into Europe, will have more value going forward for Europe and for manufacturers in India. And I think that along the way, you will have to end up seeing some sort of value creation for countries which are participating. I don't know to what extent some of the Central Asian countries will be able to do too much in terms of adding value to some of the goods along the way. It'll be more of a transport corridor and less of value addition along the way. But I think that it's something that the Iranians would definitely be looking forward to because if they're able to come out of a sanctions regime or at least reduce the sort of sanctions that are imposed on it, they would be interested in actually not just using their land as a trade route, but perhaps adding some value to the goods that are being moved across. So that's kind of the summary that I would give for the INSTC.
Yeah, so Iran has reported that there's been some 3,000 tons of goods which have been transported just between May and July this year. And this is mostly trade between Russia and India. But yes, as both of you pointed out, that the discussion on INSTC died down over the last few years. It's only been in the news until very recently, which after the war. I remember in 2017 when I was working on my dissertation on the subject, there was some interest in these alternate connectivity routes around the time, because at the time India committed to developing a key terminal of the Chabahar port, and a trilateral agreement on connectivity was signed between India, Iran, and the then Afghanistan government. But since then, the interest has moved towards maritime routes and the Indo-Pacific. Only until recently, we have seen the INSTC make a comeback with significant interest both from Russia and Iran. As far as linking the Chabahar and INST is concerned, from an Indian point of view, this was seen as an alternate to the Belt and Road Initiative. It was seen as vital to check Pakistan's influence in Afghanistan. It was seen as important to build Indian influence in Central Asia vis-a-vis China, to keep an eye on Chinese activities in Gwadar in Pakistan, which is only about 70 miles west of Chabahar. Also to check Pakistani arm twisting of the then Afghan government to reduce Afghanistan's dependence on Karachi port. But I would say that there are still limits to what India can do when it comes to Iran. For us, it's important to also realize that China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership last year, which includes various things, investments on 5G, infrastructure, banking, and also military cooperation. Iran has been quite critical of India when it comes to Kashmir. So I think there will remain limitations when it comes to using these corridors. They're not going to become central to India's connectivity plans. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Yes, but as far as you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal, quickly I would like to say that yes, certainly this would give impetus to Chabahar and INSTC, but just widely there's been a whole range of Middle East resets which we have seen in the last few months. Regional countries are balancing ties with major countries, US, Russia, China. UAE has been supportive of China's positions on Taiwan. Countries like Saudi Arabia are balancing between US and Russia. We are seeing resurgent ties between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and at the same time, some form of normalization or quasi-normalization of ties between Gulf and Israel. So if this deal goes through, this process will likely get accelerated. But as the war in Yemen tells us, there will remain limits even to that sort of normalization.
And just to add, even normalization of relations between Turkey and Israel, which is also very important, to add to this clarification on your side regarding the current trends in what is now being called West Asia, but indeed is the Middle East. So obviously we see that there is a lot of openness coming out due to the fact that on the one side, the US has been withdrawing slowly but steadily from the region due to refocusing on the Indo-Pacific. But on the other side, new regional powers have been entering, like the Dragon Bird, namely China, becoming trade partner number one, specifically for the imports of relevant strategic actually raw materials, and then of course Russia solidifying its military presence on the ground and navigating through this fluid constellation. So obviously Russia is a factor. Do you consider actually this land, it's of course also maritime, but interestingly enough, land connectivity, we are still at the international north-south transport corridor. And in a sense, before moving to the discussion on the BRI, on China's BRI, do you consider that this is an option for India also to diversify in terms of land connectivity in order to reach Europe, because the alternative would be the maritime lines, which are still, of course, the most navigated ones, with more than 80% of trade taking place along the Indo-Pacific sea lines. But still, of course, for a relevant regional power that is also projected to become world economic power number 3 in this or probably next decade, it will need also diversified supply chains and then diversified connectivity to reach the industrial heart of the West, which is, of course, still very much in France, Germany, Italy, UK. So do you consider this also as an option from an Indian perspective? But also, given the fact that the West is decoupling from Russia, and there is no coming back, regarding not just energy pipelines, energy connectivity, but also transport, logistics, and so on, that for Russia, it is also a matter of diversification to have basically to build counterweight to growing Chinese presence in Central and South Asia, and to play, in fact, China and India against each other in the future.
Yeah, I think India would keep all options on table, and just as generally pointed out by the External Affairs Minister, that we are not going to choose between one or the other option. This applies even to the continental versus maritime question. When it comes to continental connectivity, it's been widely pointed out that this route would reduce the carriage cost between India and Western Europe, and it would just take less time than the maritime route. I don't think that India would completely move to the maritime option. However, India does recognize, I think, the limitations when it comes to transit through some of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add to what Jyotsna is saying, given the limitations that exist, I think that obviously a lot of the focus will continue to be on the maritime space, but diversification is absolutely essential. And we've seen the importance of diversification, especially since COVID for many countries around. So for an aspiring manufacturing powerhouse, it's absolutely essential to consolidate some of these trade routes and connectivity projects and make sure that there is some volume that's going through this. Now, the Chinese Chinese have this, on the other hand, have a very different approach to this, and I guess it will lead up to your question on the BRI. I think that when they look at the world, they're looking at it in terms of building connectivity projects in countries where now they can actually outsource manufacturing too, because the cost of manufacturing has gone up within China, so they need to get embedded in other countries, build connectivity projects, build infrastructure there, and then set up industries with Chinese money, manufacture, sell back to either China or the West from there, and still own large sections of the supply chain. Now, when you look at something like just the connectivity projects that India is involved in, and all the countries along are, I think that each one there is trying to play to their own strengths. And in the case of INSTC, the Central Asian countries are simply just going to be places for transit. They're not really going to be adding value, as I mentioned in my earlier answer. So you're going to have, for India, it's essential to have this corridor open so that they can access the European market through both the ways, land and by sea. I think that in the event of some geopolitical event causing one of these to end up having a problem, you always have something else. The Chinese also look at things in that way. I mean, they're looking at the Arctic route. The Russians are looking at the Arctic as well, because it can be more efficient. It can be used now and then when the ice melts out there. So there are lots of options that each country would like to keep open for themselves, and India in this case would be no different.
And that is very interesting thing that you said. So the key word is obviously diversification, and once again diversification. And speaking of which, we need also to unpack the Chinese BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, as seen from today's perspective. A lot has happened since 2013, but now, of course, we have plenty of issues that are having a negative impact on the initiative. Let's start with the image of China in general in certain parts of the world, be it from the perspective of bad loans or let's say indebtedness that is now, of course, coming afore, or when it comes on the other side, also political influence. Here, of course, the key example is coming from Europe, where 3 countries from one of the most famous formats, namely the 17+1 format of China, decided to withdraw from the format, which of course is a huge, let's say, more or less hit to the reputation of China as a political actor on the ground. And I suppose that more will follow probably in the autumn. So how do you actually assess the current BRI in terms of course, connectivity, in terms of geoeconomic impact? You've already mentioned it several times with regards to Pakistan, for instance, the economic corridor, but we saw also that Pakistan was experiencing increasingly difficulties, mostly of economic nature, and of course, to great extent related directly to its dependence on Chinese money and Chinese investments. So on the one side, please take into account the land connectivity. On the other side, of course, the maritime one, with obviously the main goal of isolating India, not allowing it to have its own connectivity projects, be it the string of pearls strategy, or using the economic corridors on both sides, on the side of Pakistan and also Myanmar. So could you please elaborate on that, and also present us with your view about the future of this initiative? Will there be more, let's say, countries in the future deciding to exit, or let's say to cut off their influence, the Chinese influence along the BRI initiatives?
I think that when we look at the BRI, we have to see that in some ways China is using its connectivity projects for securing its own interests domestically. A lot of it is for that purpose. For example, they have been stockpiling grains and metals and oil. They do this for 6 months, actually now for more than nearly a year prior to the war. Absolutely. That's a very important point here, because they knew what was developing, the geopolitical situation that was developing. They were briefed on it, and they went out and they secured grains. They secured a range of commodities. Now they spent spent their dollars in some cases to acquire this, so they got rid of some dollars. They have real physical assets, which will be consumed by their people. Now, if we look at how this kind of strategy and a broader strategy to reduce your reserves in financial holdings and turn them into real assets, this is a central part of the BRI. If we look at, for example, Latin America, I think it's a good example. They own stakes in power grids. They have built hydroelectric power plants. They own first right-of-way on waterways in some of the rivers. And they have acquired agricultural land. They have mines, copper mines, lithium mines. So they know that this continent is going to be one of their main suppliers of commodities going forward. So what they do is they invest in getting leverage in these countries, to the point that it spans right from physical infrastructure to electricity to digital, 5G, for example, the rollout. And we all know that based on the 2017 legislation in China, these tech companies can hand over data to the Chinese government at any point in time. So essentially, you have vast amounts of data of the people in Latin America, which will be perused by the Chinese government. So the inordinate amount of leverage that they have over these states makes it such that if they are defaulting on any of their debt at any point in time, they simply will be forced to hand over their assets to the Chinese. This is kind of what you've seen in a different form in Sri Lanka. You have seen actually a much messier situation in Pakistan, because Pakistan acts as kind of an arbitrator between the United States and China. Their CPEC, on the other hand, if you look at it, it's one of China's flagship projects, but has been undermined by severe unrest in occupied Balochistan. So essentially what you have is a situation where, since the fall of Kabul, you find more militancy and more fighting in across the length and breadth of Pakistan. And essentially that has destabilized one of China's flagship projects. But they keep that asset still there. In fact, Pakistan will be the place where they write down the most eventually. Some of the other countries where they have BRI projects, they'll probably write down much less. The number is around 50 billion so far over the last 2 years that they've had of loans, which they've had to modify the terms of. And I think that this may continue. The nature of the BRI might change. And as I conclude my points here, I'd like to say that the idea of comparing the BRI to, say, for example, the Marshall Plan would be very different, because the Marshall Plan post-World War II really helped countries invest in their institutional capacity so that they could leverage that for economic gains, both for the United States and for their own domestic economy. What you see with the BRI is something quite different. They don't invest in the institutional capacity of countries. They invest in infrastructure with the purpose of either co-opting their elite or sinking the country in some sort of debt so that they can get the assets. So either they get the money back or they get leverage, one of the two. Now, as I mentioned in my previous answer, regarding the BRI, I had said that they want to offshore manufacturing to countries. For example, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, for example. They offshore manufacturing to these countries, and they say that they need to keep the wages down. They're not in it for the economic prosperity necessarily of the state beyond a certain point. But the Marshall Plan had a very different objective. Now, the fact that part of what happened post-World War II, the demilitarization of Japan and Germany, has ended up coming back to bite the Western world order, Western bloc over time, I think that's kind of something we're seeing happen, but 70 years down the line. But what we're seeing with China is that they have a different objective for the BRI. The nature of the BRI will change. I think that some of their investments are definitely sunk, but they will continue to plod on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's move now to Jyostna.
Adding to what Surya said.
And intransparent.
Yes.
And that suits autocratic regimes, countries which do not have that sort of transparency domestic. Lack of accountability is something that China actually thrives off. And ironically, the Western economy to a large extent has been dependent on the lack of transparency in China, which furnished them with cheap goods, with the sort of low inflation, which otherwise the West would have never enjoyed for the last 20 years.
There are no lengthy feasibility studies, for example. Everything is quickly executed, and it works well for these countries which have corrupt leadership.
But if there is one positive impact related directly to the BRI, that is that it, in fact, it created competition. Now, if we remember back in 2013, when it was launched as the One Belt, One Road, then later to become Belt and Road Initiative, it was more or less well described, defined as a marketing, marketing idea, marketing concept, not really feasible geostrategic concept, but in fact now it resulted in a real competition where on the one side the United States and on the other side the European Union in fact launched major billion worth infrastructure concepts, which and they mean it seriously. Just to give one example, with the European Union and the Global Gateway, which is 600 billion infrastructure project, half of it dedicated to African countries, another half of it also dedicated to Asia and the Middle East, and even the direct neighborhood. So let's talk a little bit in the end of this conversation about the current macro perspective, about what is really going on in the global context when it comes to the Western response. Do you actually consider these kind of new initiatives and projects as let's say example or signal for a new Cold War 2.0 scenario, or bifurcation, as I call it, a bifurcation of the international relations of the global system, in a sense that the system is being split in two. All of the relevant networks are already witnessing this kind of bipolarization, and each is competing with the other over the hearts and minds of everyone in between. So how do you consider the Western response? Do you also consider it as a coherent one, or would you actually rather expect cracks within this Western response, where, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, which I think is going to happen, is that there will be a growing cleavage between Anglosphere and continental European partners when it comes to their approach to China, but also to Russia, and of course to the American global interests. So how they position themselves in this, of course, bifurcation. And now with, with new reality in Europe, where do you see Europe in this, big global puzzle of geopolitics? I think Surya mentioned at the beginning something about the trend of deindustrialization. Europe is in the middle of a digital and energy transition, and yet also in the middle of the biggest energy crisis, which, by the way, was not caused by the launch of Russia's war against Ukraine. In fact, was already ongoing last year prior to the war, but now, of course, was also amplified, and specifically not just amplified by the war, but also amplified by the decoupling between Europe and Russia when it comes to the energy sector. So
I think this trend has been ongoing for a few years now, especially since 2016-17, where infrastructure and connectivity initiatives have been a part of various Indo-Pacific strategies, which many countries have announced. We had the Trump administration's Blue Dot Network, which was a kind of a certification program for infrastructure projects. The UK laid out the Clean Green Initiative. The EU, like you said, had the Global Gateway Initiative, and the Biden administration before the PGII announced the launch of the Build Back Better World Initiative. My concern is that it seems that these countries are churning out connectivity initiatives one after another. And while like you said, it is great that the BRI has created this kind of competition where we are all focusing on connectivity projects, I think the discussion now is moving slowly towards how to actually successfully implement these projects, cut through the bureaucracy. There are several departments involved, ensuring that, how can we commit on a long-term basis to invest a certain amount of money towards these various projects. And like I said, how to make sure that the implementation is quick so that the Chinese are not able to outcompete us. Like it's been pointed already, I think Europe is now trying to realize that it has perhaps not been very active when it comes to geopolitics. We would also like to point out the division between the Anglosphere and continental Europe when it comes to the big questions of Indo-Pacific and various geopolitical changes which are taking place in challenging the international system. Even if we look closer home towards ASEAN, I think there is no agreement on how to best formulate our policies in the Indo-Pacific. There is an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, but it's a bit of everything and not as focused as it should have been. So I think the discussions are now perhaps taking place on some of these questions which are to do with connectivity projects. Should there be a division of labor of sorts wherein we all focus on various parts of projects? How do we compete with the Chinese on delivering on time? How do we can form triangular cooperation mechanisms wherein two countries choose a partner country to work in for infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I think that it's essential when we look at the situation here in Europe and what I really call the Great Reorder now, which I think is being enforced in some ways by two authoritarian countries, China and Russia, joining forces together to really blunt the American sphere of influence, which they see in Europe. And I think that one of the objectives is to deindustrialize Europe by raising energy costs. I mean, obviously this has been in play, as you mentioned, since 2021 itself, before the war. But it's accelerated since. It's been compounded by years of poor energy policy, anti-nuclear, anti-coal policy, which has come at the cost of a real economic national security for the Union. And it's not just Germany, it's for the entire Union, because we have a combined monetary unit as well here. I think that when Russia and China look at Europe, they see it going back to what it has been hundreds of years ago, a deeply divided, or at least a somewhat divided continent, which doesn't have access to natural resources, so it will be constrained no matter what. Its aging demographics are definitely looked upon as a weak aspect of its economy. So the idea behind what is happening, if you look at it from the adversarial point of view, Europe's adversaries' point of view, they're looking to force firms to offshore manufacturing to China or from China to other countries. They want to kind of exploit the weakness in the consensus formation that you find within the European Union as different groups kind of seek out their own interests. And kind of these countries end up fraying the cooperation between states. Essentially, they want to fracture the EU and kind of turn it into a weak unit. And ultimately, they hope this blunts the American sphere of influence as well. Now, what Europe can do, what has the response been so far? I think that there has been a slow realization, but of what can really be afflicting them. And we've seen two governments fall over the last few months, and one in the UK and the other in Italy. And this has a momentum of its own. It starts creating more disruptions within the political systems of countries. So take an example of what happened yesterday and you had tweeted about this, in fact, Velina, but Wall Street Journal said that Germany was looking to restart 3 nuclear power plants, but then they ended up not doing it. The economy minister comes out saying, Habeck, he's like, we're not going to be doing this. We haven't found consensus on this, essentially. That's what it meant. Now, it's because you have coalition politics which are tugging at the center of decision making, and it's creating problems. I want to zoom out from this and say, look at how this fits into globalization 2.0, which I think will be really what kind of defines wealth creation for large parts of the world. If you look at it as essentially the free world, how they will be generating value. And I think that a lot of topics that we have covered till now, transport corridors, free trade agreements that bolster the capacity utilization of these trade networks. There's a fantastic piece written by 3 authors at ORF. If I'll just pull it up, it was on global value chains and India's role in that. It's a great report. It's called "Building Resilient Global Value Chain Linkages in India." It's written by Terry Chapman, Janvi Tripathi, and Rakesh Kumar Sinha. It's a detailed report which goes into explaining what reforms India needs to institute in order to essentially replace China in many areas so that it can provide stability and security to supply chains, which essentially will feed through into stability for Europe. Given the fact that Europe is now going to be alone in some regard, in terms of doesn't have access to Russian gas, it requires goods to be arriving at its shores without the fear of them being turned off, the flow of goods being turned off. They need a trustworthy partner and a set of trustworthy partners. It's not, they don't want to just invest in one, but many. And I think that at the base of all these new multilateral engagements that are being formed is, I think, a hope that India is able to step up to the plate over the next 5 to 10 years and deliver that stability in terms of trade, economics, trade, and eventually, maritime security for at least the Indian Ocean region as well. So I think that from the European context, I think that this has been underplayed, the value that India can potentially play in the future for them, for their security. I think that we've seen a lot of rhetoric which has been short-termist, and that's not been particularly helpful. I think that going forward, that has to give way to something that's much more longer term and much more strategic. I think that these multilateral engagements that are forming are showing that there is a group of people who are looking towards, but it needs to be doubled down, and more discussion, more positive dialogue is required on this to really create globalization 2.0 through the new free world.
Two very short questions on my side to finish this conversation. We are already beyond the 60 minutes format, but given the fact that we have two guests, I think that we could expand the format a little bit. And the first question is obviously one related once again to Europe in a sense of your expectations for the future. Namely, do you think that US would step in once again like it did following the Second World War with the Marshall Plan, now obviously coming up with, let's say, new TTIP project to create a larger trade bloc between the European Union as the largest, common market in the world for the moment, or at least as the largest trade bloc, and the United States on the other side, in order to solidify, or let's say prevent Europe from this industrialization. This is, my first question. And the second one is also related to commodities, because no relevant regional power can in fact convert its regional portfolio, its regional geoeconomic cloud into global power projection without actually the access, permanent access to commodities. Now with the green transition and the digital transition, we know that the use of commodities will significantly increase. Some say exploration of minerals, rare earths for the decarbonization will increase up to 500%. In unimaginable scope and scale of exploitation and exploration, which of course will also lead once again to military tensions, to conflicts, and so on and so forth. Do you think that, given that fact, there will be, let's say, new powers which will basically base their, global cloud on the access to minerals and rare earths? And once again, Surya provided the counterexample of how, for instance, China and Russia are basically trying to deindustrialize Europe because relevant access to these commodities will be becoming increasingly limited in the future. And once again, the European powers will have to rely on, on alternative sources, which are not easy to be found in the short term, at least. So how do you see this as a general trend? And also, how do you see India's approach in that matter regarding its growing role in the world? Let's start with you, Surya, and then Jyotsna will actually have plenty of time to elaborate and finalize the conversation.
Perfect. I think when we look at bifurcation of the commodity market and the use of commodities and access to commodities as an instrument of power, which basically adds another dimension to a country's overall comprehensive national power. If you look at the case of China and the size of their import market coupled with Russia's size of their export market together, it actually outdoes their combined GDP in terms of comprehensive power projection multifold, because they can hold the West, which is a consumption-driven economy, to essentially to ransom. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing significant tensions domestically in the United States on the political front because of high inflation. Inflation undoes governments. We've seen it already here in Europe. If we look at democracies, they end up suffering the most in this context because the public turns against the government. They don't necessarily have the patience to see through long inflationary periods. When we talk about the battle between authoritarianism and democracies, I think we really are seeing it in play right now. But on the other hand, we don't see the sort of cooperation between democracies that you see as you see between the cooperation between authoritarian governments. And I think that's part of it is driven by special interest groups with certain ideological leanings, which have captured sections of the power circles in the United States, in Europe, which I think have actively ended up subverting the sort of relationship that should have been built between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. And I want to get to the point on India here. As much as it's important to build the relationship, and everyone knows that this relationship, Indo-US relationship and Indo-European relationship also needs to be built out, there needs to be an understanding of each other's countries. And I think that there has been a lack of investment in the academic space in this, which I think has filtered through to some extent into how governments have conducted their messaging. What that does, at least in the context of India, it does end up sometimes ruffling feathers, because Indians tend to have a very long, they have a sense of history, which is slightly different from how the West looks at history. When when there is a statement that comes out which is not particularly, friendly, it seems kind of jarring or is not related to what the reality is in India on social issues, for example, people turn around and say, like, why does the West behave in this particular fashion? And because India is a democracy, eventually, if this keeps building over time, you do not want anti-Western sentiment to build up in a relationship which should be very strong and should help each other out. I think that is one aspect that needs to be worked on, especially in the West, and more literature, more genuine and academically sound literature should be produced for helping build the relationship between democracies. On the point of how the West is I think dealing with this crisis and whether they can integrate better with the United States, I think we're already seeing this to some extent. The U.S. will be exporting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of natural gas to Europe over the next decade. Now, this is going to come at obviously a cost, because if Europe is having to import majority of its gas through ships, which can essentially travel to Asia and fill up Chinese or Japanese or any of the East Asian countries' gas storages, you're essentially having a competition in price between Asia and Europe for the same material, same molecules. In some ways, that keeps Europe off balance. So they really have no option except to take this energy price volatility. What they can do is they can try and reduce costs in other areas. They can try and transform their economy to a more digital sort of economy, which is less dependent on manufactured goods and kind of moving into a new age. So I think more investment has to be done in R&D, a better relationship with the US for getting capital over to Europe, for investing in European high-end technologies and R&D is probably the way forward. But I actually have a very pessimistic view of the old industry of Europe. I think it's going to go. And I don't think there's any real way to save this. European leaders have to be creative, to think of something new, and also be cognizant of the fact that they're Western liberal democracies, and their biggest partner eventually in the world will be outside the United States, will end up being India, which is an Eastern liberal democracy with its own set of values, with its own understanding of how freedom is expressed domestically and abroad. But as a partner, it will remain a stabilizing force, that stabilization is something the West should partner with. I think they should find value in it, and I think that awareness must be raised over the coming 5 years, because this is a critical moment.
Thank you. And before moving to Jyostna, who will have plenty of time, it's up to you to decide how long do you want to respond to these questions. I also want to address the issue of literature, because Surya actually pointed to a study by ORF, and coincidentally, I was in fact attending together with Terry Chapman the same global forum in Kigali in Rwanda, and I can only recommend, of course, this work of hers together with her other colleagues, which you can easily find by going on the webpage of ORF or ORF America, I think. So, Jyotsna, the floor is yours. Feel free to elaborate on the topics.
I'll simply sum up. So, yes, great power competition is here. It's back. We are seeing an increasingly bifurcated world, and it's likely that after this war, this bifurcation would get even more intense. It has triggered a trend towards deglobalization. And this has also been accelerated by the pandemic, with countries trying to develop indigenous capacities for critical industries. This trend has also been quite visible in the fossil fuels market, where now there is a differentiation between good or bad oil and gas. We are going to see greater preference for hydrocarbons. This will also, of course, lead to very interesting disruptions in climate politics, where developed countries are now renewing their pledges, and that is, of course, being keenly watched by the developing world. Yes, as Surya pointed out, there's a need for the developed world and for our partners in the West, perhaps make greater effort to understand how we shape our worldviews. It's critical that we see that interests matter, and fewer countries now will give in to shaming on values. And that will also trigger a trend towards multipolarity, which we are seeing with greater interest in expansion of bodies like the BRICS. We are seeing the de-dollarization of the financial system. Also, I would just add, I would like to sort of go back to what we started our discussion with, which is that this will also see the multilateral order reforming, where the focus is more on outcomes than on structures. So I think that's how I would sum it up.
And maybe what is your vision for India's position, given this bifurcation and given this, growing actually systemic competition and decoupling? Do you also consider India going, obviously will be siding with the United States and with under Anglosphere formats, but on the other side, will probably be equally interested in going a third way with the European Union by, let's say, negotiating a free trade agreement, and then using this potential also in geoeconomic terms?
I think for India, the ultimate goal is to develop, to become self-reliant, and whatever it takes towards that goal. US is a critical partner for us in that endeavor, but that wouldn't mean that we shut doors to other partners and overlook potential channels of cooperation with Russia, even with China. We have seen that how this question of self-reliance has in some ways reduced our maneuvering space when it comes to the war on Ukraine, and that remains our critical objective.
I'd like to add one very small point to that, if that's okay. I think that this idea of self-reliance is something that all major powers which ended up becoming superpowers have gone through at some point through their economic development. If we look at the United States before World War II, and we look at China throughout, even after they were admitted into the WTO, deeply protectionist, did not give market access to other countries. The United States was protectionist for decades. The British, during their colonial era, they were mercantilists. Now, if we look at how these countries have, large empires or countries with significant power ascended, there is this focus on being able to control all the factors, as many factors as you can control, to generate the maximum economic output. You have 5 factors of production: your land, labor, capital, technology, and entrepreneurship. Now, how do you optimize this given the constraints that you have in each of them? Now, you have domestic constraints for each one of these, and you have, in a globalized world, you have constraints that come from abroad. How do you loosen those constraints? Through extracting comparative and competitive advantages, through establishing trade linkages with like-minded countries that share interests, that share values, that share specific geopolitical longer-term objectives. In this context, I think that the importance of bringing together countries that have these interests will have a significant impact on how China and Russia together and China alone will end up developing over the coming years, and what their capabilities really would be. Unfortunately, I feel in the current geopolitical environment, at least in the United States, there's very little appetite to take China on for what it is and be able to harness these multilateral relationships with countries that should otherwise be very strong partners, and take them to the real logical conclusion that those relationships should go to, because their domestic politics really is just fraying. And confidence in the government from the people is at a record low in the US. And what happens within the United States has a cascading impact on how they relate to the rest of the world, and what the response collectively can possibly be to China. So I think this is the United States, as much as, for example, India, which must reform tremendously in order to be able to step up to the plate. Every country has its own issues to fix. And more emphasis, I think, needs to be placed on getting each country's house in order, whether it's Europe, getting consensus together within the US to find a long-term sustainable sort of plan, both domestically and internationally. In India, to be able to reform the bureaucracy, to push land reforms, labor reforms, to actually get that 15%, 20% sort of growth that you can end up seeing in say, like how you saw in the Chinese manufacturing sector nearly 15 years ago, 20 years ago. You need to get that. So each country, if they do their bit, these multilateral relationships can actually they can be fostered in a much better and more productive manner. So I can just hope for that. And the point you said about literature is something that, academics and observers, people in media, we all work on the margins to try and affect and impact the way people think within the governing space. And I hope that more of it can be done in a positive light.
And on this positive note, I think this was a perfect ending for our conversation. So Jyostna and Surya, thank you very much for staying with me, for covering all these relevant topics, and for expressing your views and basically your personal views, of course, and giving us your excellent insights into these quite relevant topics that are here to stay. And I wish you all the best. And once again, thank you.
Thank you, Velina.
Thank you, Velina.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.